Hello all, I hope this finds you well. Today's lecture marks the first of a series of two presentations on race and ethnicity and how they tie into the previous discussion concerning sexuality, gender, and biological sex. Because as I will hopefully demonstrate, all of these topics intersect to form you as a person and also people's interactions with and expectations of you. So the definition of race that we are going to use in this class is a social construct with no genetic basis that divides humans into supposedly discrete groups. There are some key sort of terminology sort of embedded within this sentence. There is no genetic basis, meaning that it is basically impossible to differentiate individuals based on supposedly genetic markers to understand race. This was thought to not be the case in recent history for the most part, but we largely in anthropology, specifically biological anthropology, have argued for some time that really there is no way to genetically differentiate groups of individuals. That does not stop individuals from trying. They'll call it racial clines or other terminology to sort of parse out differences, but really at the end of the day, it's a futile effort because there really is not that much difference between individuals at the genetic level, at least enough to justify racial categories. Discrete groups basically just means that you can have, for instance, a black group, a white group, an Asian group. This is impossible, and these are social constructs. This has been developed through basically bad science over time and propagated into common discourse. So, for instance, we do talk about race as a real thing in the United States. As you found most likely in the Gravely reading, race is real in the sense that it has consequences, but we'll get into that in a second. So, I have a sentence here that I want you to sort of also compartmentalize when you're thinking about race. Scientists are a part of their social context. Their ideals about what race is are not simply scientific ones, are not simply driven by the data. It is also informed by the societies in which they live. In a society like the United States that tries to place individuals into certain groups, it basically reifies the thought that there are different groups that can be categorized based on science. However, what ends up happening is the categories that we create to talk about race basically makes race. By that I mean, for instance, if you talk about Black Americans having high rates of high blood pressure, you have then put them in the category of African Americans, and then now you're just looking at high blood pressure. But if you look at, for instance, high blood pressure among different supposedly racial groups, you'll see that for the most part, high blood pressure is a pervasive, chronic, and sort of epidemiological condition. Additionally, there are certain reasons that, for instance, African Americans have higher rates of high blood pressure that are not based on their biology. They're based on multiple factors, including the average diet of African American or Black populations based on a history of low economic status, for instance, which shapes the foods that are available to you. And there's a term that you may be unfamiliar with called a food desert, basically meaning that there is no healthy source or of food, whether in terms of it being too expensive or there no being grocery stores, for instance, around you, that give you access to clean, healthy food. So, for the most part, you have to rely on foods that are high caloric intake and also high fat intake. So, for instance, you might have to eat a lot of fast food because it's just the only thing close to you and there is no clean or nutritious option around you. This primarily is found in minority groups that are of low economic status. So, of course, high blood pressure is going to be higher among African Americans if African Americans predominantly live in areas that don't have access to nutritious foods. They must find other means of doing so. Additionally, excuse me, racism has also been found to be a risk factor for high blood pressure because when you experience racism, you may internalize that as stress, and that stress can lead to high blood pressure, can lead to a reduced immune system, which also exposes you to a higher infectious disease burden, which also exacerbates the health consequences that African Americans or Black Americans face in our country. So, race is a social construct. Well, where did this construct come from? Remember, in anthropology, we must also look in the history of a certain culture or a certain society to understand how we got to where we are today. You can see this in the video I'm going to have you watch. It is 10 minutes long, so I'm factoring that into how long I'm going to be presenting, so don't worry, I'm not going to go over time. But make sure you watch it because it is really important to understand the sort of foundational concepts in which I'm trying to engage you all with here. And also to sort of think about the history of race as a construct largely developed because of the slave trade and the ways that individuals, including our supposed founding fathers, used it to justify enslavement of Africans as well. So on that note, there have been multiple policies in the United States that have shaped race as a social construct with consequences in terms of biology and also other social dynamics. One term is called hypodescent, which is a socially constructed racial classification system in which a person of mixed heritage is automatically categorized as a member of a certain racial group, usually the least privileged. So in the United States, the so-called one-drop rule, as it was called, for instance, if a white individual and a Black individual had a child, that child is Black. It is not white. That is how they were classified in government documents and how they were reasoned with in terms of being able to vote and being able to hold land and also the US Census. Additionally, racial categories in the US have changed over time, of course. So these are not things that are set in stone. Again, they are constructed by us, reified by us, and because of that, they sometimes also change because of the way we think about race and the categories in which we use, which is influenced by so-called intermixing of so-called races, as well as through immigration and migration, which has been largely the entire history of the United States. So I want you to also just sort of browse this link as well, so you get an understanding of different categories and how they have changed over time. Since 2010, you can check more than one race/ethnicity box in a way to sort of catch individuals that may prescribe to one or more races. The US Census ran into an issue a few years ago where they had a large amount of individuals checking themselves as white, because in certain countries, their definition of white may not be what the United States considers to be white. For example, Cuban immigrants and other immigrants from Latin American countries that see themselves as white based on the cultural categorization system that they use in their own country may not be considered to be white among the common populace in the United States. So a lot of Latin Americans, this still happens largely in census and other demographic surveys, mark themselves as white. They're not wrong, it just doesn't mesh with the US understanding of white. So keep that in mind, and that just remember that these categories definitely aren't universal. So some more definitions. The first one is race ideology. Think of a language ideology. Remember, it's the set of ideas about a certain topic that we understand and conceptualize. So in terms of race ideology, we have a set of ideas about race that allows the discriminatory behaviors of individuals and institutions to seem rational or normal. For instance, let's take food stamps as an example. There is a concept that is used derogatorily called the welfare queen, which is an individual that supposedly is exploiting the welfare system or is exploiting the food stamp system in order to, for instance, not work but still get the amenities that our capitalist society thinks that you must earn. That largely has been prescribed on minority individuals, predominantly Black women. So a lot of individuals, when they're talking about so-called welfare queens or those influencing the system, largely are conceptualizing minority women. Why is that the case? And why is that justified? And that's my alarm. Alexa, stop. Because of our history of understanding race in the United States and the sort of boxing of certain minority groups as poor or not hardworking individuals. Again, social constructs that have no basis in biology or reality, but because these categories are used in common parlance, basically the way we talk about individuals, this becomes sort of ingrained in an individual's mind through enculturation that this is the norm or this is abnormal. This is what certain racial groups do, opposed to what other racial groups do. That alarm really threw me off. Additionally, we have racial formation, which is the process by which social, economic, and political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories. I'm getting at this already, but basically, you can think about this in terms of the history of whiteness in the United States. So, for instance, in the mid-1800s, Irish Catholic immigrants were classified as non-white and inferior, and there were deportations. We're seeing this today with, for instance, individuals trying to cross the border from Mexico. The category of white has changed over time. It is a very fluid concept. For instance, Irish Americans, individuals from Scotland, were not considered to be white. Jewish immigrants were also not considered to be white on the US Census, with implications for immigration, for instance, as the US tried to shape who was coming into the country. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've been doing this for some time. Additionally, think about what racial category you might put former President Barack Obama into. Most individuals would say he's the first black president, and he said so himself, which is totally fine. That's what he identifies as. But additionally, Barack Obama also identifies as being from a mixed household. His mother, if by most individuals' accountings, is very white, or was very white. As a side note, she also was an anthropologist, and you can read Barack Obama's mother's work online as well if you were interested. She primarily was focused on pottery in the Philippines, I think, and it's an interesting read. I kind of skimmed it, but it's a sidebar. Most individuals in the United States, because of our conceptualization of race, identify Barack Obama as a black man. However, his mother was white and his father was black. Most individuals would not say Barack Obama is a white man. Think about the reasons for that, and think about the history of racial categorization in the United States. Think back even to the one-drop rule or hypodescent. What you look like may not, again, reflect your internal biology, because there is no racial markers in our biology. These are all constructs that we have. Additionally, within predominantly black populations, let's take Brazil for an example. They have a gradient, say they very broadly. In Brazil, there is a gradient essentially of blackness and brownness that would look very different than our classification system in the United States, which is very literally black and white. Racial categories are constructs over time, and additionally, they have real consequences in terms of how individuals think about people today because of that. So, very quickly diving into the Brazil example I'm alluding to. Anthropology likes to conduct what's called cross-cultural comparison, which I had mentioned before in this class. Basically, CCC is comparing different cultural groups to find commonalities or differences. When we are comparing racial categories in the US versus or compared to racial categories in Brazil, we see two very different classification systems. In Brazil, race is often thought of as a continuum or gradient scale with black or white on opposite ends. I have a video here and I would like you to watch it. It's not very long, and it goes over some of the racial categories in the country based on a very small sample. And it sort of makes you think about, again, how in the United States we have a very different conceptualization of race compared to some other countries. Again, reifying that this is not based in biology, but based on cultural understandings of race. In Brazil, different factors can influence your whiteness or blackness. It could be something as simple as your hair type, the money you have, your social status, and also other facial features. On the right here, this is sort of a broad 5-tier categorization system. But remember, as I just discussed, Brazil really has a cascading amount of categories in terms of how they understand race. And again, since it's internalized in the culture of Brazil, they are very able to say, okay, this individual is this individual is this. Just as in the United States, we would say this individual is black, or this individual is Latinx or Latino, for instance. So, touching briefly on the documentary that I had you all watch over the weekend, hopefully, Alan Goodman is an anthropologist who is featured in the film, and he's a well-known anthropologist who deals with a variety of different topics, including race as a category. And he says race is an idea that is prescribed to biology. We get to this later on in the Gravely reading, but what Alan Goodman here is trying to say is that our ideas about what race is get imprinted on an individual's body. We think in the United States, oh, there must be something in the biology of African Americans that predisposes them to high blood pressure. There must be something in the biology of Native American groups which predisposes them to diabetes or alcoholism. This, in fact, is not based on biological reality, but it is shaped by historical and economic context over time. A concept that some people find confusing is because it kind of goes against our understanding of difference in the US, is that there is more genetic variation within a population than when it is compared to an outside population because of mutations over time. That sounds complicated, so let's look at an example here at the bottom. There is more genetic variation among humans within Africa than outside of it, because we spent most of our evolutionary history in Africa. In terms of modern science, we understand that our far distant ancestors originated in Africa. And because of that, our ancestors, and then later on modern humans, have lived in Africa since the dawning of our species and the species that came before us. Because of that, and because of how genetics works in terms of mutations, as DNA becomes further mixed and mixed and mixed, you get different combinations, which can lead to more genetic variation. Because of that, there is more genetic variation among African individuals than there is outside of it. However, in the US, it's been polled multiple times. If you say, what is the difference between this individual versus this individual? Let's take, for instance, 2 African Americans versus an African American and a white European American. Most individuals would say that the white European American and the black African American are more different from each other than 2 African individuals. That is not the case. The 2 African individuals actually have more genetic variation, meaning that there is little genetic difference, if at all, between a white European and a black African, because there has been less time and opportunity for mutations to take place. So we have been building up to this statement that race as biology is a fiction. It's a story that we tell ourselves. It is a story that scientists tell and they propagate by using racial categories, again, pulling from the Gravely reading. So what about ethnicity? Because remember, this class topic for the day and for the week is race and ethnicity. Ethnicity you can think of as clusters of people who have common cultural traits that they distinguish from those of other people. Ethnicity is open, flexible, and can change over time. An example of this that you can think of is the category Latinx. Basically, that X indicates that this is basically an amalgam of different Hispanic and Latin American populations and groups that have been sort of broadly put under the umbrella of Latinx. There's a lot of variance between, for instance, Mexican culture and Belizean culture, Ecuadorian culture, but we prescribe this category to sort of have a way to talk about them. Again, we create racial categories and also ethnic categories. When you're creating ethnic categories, this is not necessarily a bad thing to do. It's just a way for us to have a common language in which to talk about certain groups of individuals. Some people would say that also applies to race, but ethnicity allows some flexibility because it acknowledges culture as really the foundation for grouping people together. People share commonalities in the foods they eat. People share commonalities in the music they listen to. People share commonalities in where they like to live and what language that they like to speak. In the United States, this gets a little murky because we often use race and ethnicity as interchangeable. However, the two terms have very different histories and they have very different definitions if you actually look at how they are defined in the scholarship and understandings that people share about such terms. This is because ethnicity and culture are related phenomena and bear no intrinsic connection to human biological variations or race. If you hear the leaf blower in my background, I apologize. Since ethnicity and culture are related, where does race fit into this? On US Census or demographic surveys, I'm sure you've seen multiple times that race and ethnicity basically is one checkbox. What race and or ethnicity are you? You choose from a list of options or you write an option. This makes basically the US Census questionable in terms of how it's understanding demography, which is the study of demographics. Because of these different categorization systems, and people may have a very different understanding of what racial category they belong to in terms of also their ethnicity. There may be individuals that identify as Latinx in terms of their ethnicity that may put white or they may put black. So there needs to be that built-in flexibility that understands that people have different conceptions of themselves, which is shaped by their own cultural upbringing. So far, I've been talking about culture and ethnicity as sort of a matter-of-fact thing that happens. But in the social sciences, we also like to understand some of the mechanisms that are at play concerning how this happens. So the first one is a concept which you should know called ethnogenesis, which is the gradual emergence of a new, distinct ethnic identity in response to changing social circumstances. So, for instance, we refer to Irish Americans in terms of this being a distinction that in the United States we often use. We like to tack on something American. So African American, Irish American, Italian American. These are ways that people in the United States sort of categorize or catalog individuals. However, ethnic identity also changes over time. And for instance, Italian American culture, if you want to call it that, looks different than Italian culture, if you can even have an umbrella Italian culture to begin with. Remember in anthropology how we concern ethnicity and culture, you can keep going down different levels or scales and really pick apart the sort of understanding that there is so-called one culture for a certain country. Additionally, in terms of how new cultures develop or maybe even become assimilated in the larger power structure and social structure of a certain country, we can look at ethnic assimilation. So for instance, when second-generation immigrant children learn English as their primary language in school, they also learn culture along with that language because it's impossible to really separate language from culture. Language is embedded within culture and is used to express culture. So if you are, for instance, a second-generation immigrant learning English in primary school, however, only your family members know Spanish, then there's going to start to be a divide or a miscommunication that occurs because you no longer are able to effectively communicate with older generations, which can manifest in a loss of historical and cultural knowledge and also just a disconnect from your family members. Remember, how we conceptualize culture is that it is passed down and it is shared with individuals. If you are less able to share certain cultural practices, then over time, your original culture, if you want to call it that, starts to also change over time. And what may end up happening is when individuals enter the United States, because English is such a favored language here, there may be less emphasis on learning the sort of original tongue of where you originated from in terms of your ancestry. This also has been seen in policy, where for the most parts, English has been the sort of preferred or promoted language in our school systems and our education system overall. In US policy, for instance, everyone speaks English in the Senate. And because of that, largely the experiences of individuals that don't have English as their primary language may be misheard or underrepresented, which can then influence how people perceive so-called American culture. There may be a different way of thinking, or many different ways of thinking, that are not having a voice to express themselves because there's no platform in which for them to do so. So over time, there may be so-called an American culture as a broad umbrella, but the local intricacies as well as different ways of thinking get lost along the way. Multiculturalism, which really is the combining of and interactions with different cultures, has really always been happening since humans have been humans. In terms of immigration, of intermixing through marriage, or just simple reproduction. You can even think about this in terms of our biology. There really is, again, no biological basis for a category such as a white person or a black person. We've just been mixing for too long for that categorization to really have any meaning whatsoever. So we should always question the intentions and motivations of individuals or groups in power who speak against multiculturalism. Watch this short video, and when they are using the word culture, are they using it as a proxy for race? Think about that before you go on to the next slide. So I have a quote here from the Smedleys, one of your authors for the week that I also have referenced earlier on in this presentation. And they say, race is a means of creating and enforcing social order, a lens through which differential opportunity and equality are structured. I think this is best seen in the Gravely reading, which I will engage with next. But before you move on, maybe pause and just think about what I've said so far and what you think this is trying to say. So Clarence Gravely, the author of How Race Becomes Biology, is a well-known anthropologist who got in a bit of hot water because he critiqued anthropology, which has had a long history since basically Franz Boas, of arguing that race isn't real. That makes a lot of sense, right? However, just because race is a social category does not make it a lived reality. There is no biological basis for race. However, when we use race and how we understand race can have biological consequences. So the author says, the sociocultural reality of race and racism has biological consequences for racially defined groups. Again, I just said that Clarence Gravely was a critique of anthropologists who basically just didn't want to engage with race because it doesn't exist at the biological level. And it was thought that any discussion of race would basically just make it more real. But that's a circular argument because it ends up becoming real as a result of you either not engaging with it and scientists using it, or engaging with it and it becoming a sort of category that we have to, by necessity, use when we're talking about racism, for instance. So that may be confusing. So let's look at the next example here. Epidemiological statistical, basically, evidence for racial inequities in health reinforces public understanding of race as biology. This shapes the questions researchers ask and the ways they interpret their data, reinforcing a racial view of biology. Let's take high rates of obesity and diabetes among African American males, for instance. Me just saying that says that there is a group called African American males, and they have high rates of obesity and diabetes. That is what is talked about in the science, and that gets internalized as, okay, African American males are at higher risk for diabetes and obesity, as well as high blood pressure and other health consequences. But the reasoning behind that is not based on their biology. There's nothing in the biology of African American males that makes them more susceptible to high rates of obesity or diabetes. We should look at their environments and how that shapes their diet and lifestyle, for instance. If you live in a food desert where there's not a lot of access to nutritious foods or a healthy grocery store, you sort of have to rely on other means of going to get food. You might have to go to get a lot of fast food or a lot of takeout with a high caloric and high sugar diet, for instance, which can make you more susceptible to high blood pressure, obesity, and also type 2 diabetes. Additionally, racism can also lead to stress, which can also lead to overeating. There are a lot of different factors in the social and built environment to pull from public health language, because I'm also taking a public health degree while I'm doing my anthropology PhD. And this social and built environment has a lot of different consequences in terms of how it shapes your health potentials. But basically what this is trying to say in the article is that there is no biological basis for race. However, how we talk about race and how we internalize and externalize racial categories can have biological consequences on our health, for instance. Additionally, this can happen intergenerationally, which I will get into soon. I mentioned this concerning Native American populations as well as Black populations in the US, but there is a long history in the sciences which is still propagated today that there are biological sort of markers that can influence your health. This is called racial genetic determinism, which is the belief that genetic factors among racial groups are a large influencer on health. For instance, Native American or indigenous populations were for some time thought to have what's called a thrifty gene. This is a hypothesis that's been tested and largely refuted. However, it is still used in sort of common understandings and scientific papers concerning why indigenous populations are seemingly highly susceptible to diabetes. Basically, what the thrifty gene hypothesis says is that in the history of Native American or indigenous groups, there were long periods of famines that individuals basically just had to endure. And over time, evolutionarily speaking, they developed a thrifty gene to basically store all the nutrients they could find, so to be able to weather the storm, basically, in terms of droughts or famines. So what this was being used for in terms of today was saying, oh, the reason that Native American individuals are at high risk for diabetes is because of this thrifty gene, which basically makes their bodies inferior in the sense that they store a lot of sugar. They store a lot of fat content. However, we must look at also again at the environment of Native American individuals. In the history of, for instance, sequestering them into reservations, Native American groups had to thrive, or had to survive really, on diets that were largely Western and atypical to their expected diets of grains and other vegetables and foodstuffs. Because now they're having to eat a lot of sugary foods, a lot of wheat, a lot of flour, their diet has had to rapidly adapt to this new context, which can make an individual more susceptible to diabetes and being overweight. We see this even happening among immigrant populations entering the US. So for instance, Mexican immigrants entering the country rapidly undergo what's called a nutrition transition, which basically rapidly increases their rate of diabetes and being overweight, especially among younger children that are more easily influenced by their diets during their early development. So in terms of this being a biological marker, not really. In terms of this being a marker of political, economic, and nutritional contexts, much more likely. Human biology and health are called, in anthropology, as a sort of biocultural process. They are comprised of biological and cultural elements which interact with and influence each other. We are humans. We have a human body, of course. However, our interaction with our social and built environment can have biological consequences. Think again to gravity. Really, everything we do is a biocultural process, and I'm a biocultural anthropologist for a reason, because culture influences biology, biology influences culture. Two other terms of, I think, extreme relevance to this class, and also understanding the structure and context of the US, are structural violence and symbolic violence. These two definitions are going to be used very often in this course, so it is important that you understand them and can sort of be able to conceptualize their usage, let's say, in practical applications. Additionally, they may be very useful in terms of thinking about, let's say, a quiz question or two. So keep that in mind. Structural violence you can think of as the institutions and policies that impact social, mental, and biological health. I will give examples of both structural and symbolic violence in a second, but start to think about what is meant by institutions and policies in terms of how they can influence the social world as well as our health. In terms of the social, we also have symbolic violence, which is ideas and ways of speaking which negatively impact social, mental, and biological health. These two terms, at their intersection, create what is called structural racism, or also known as institutional racism in the scholarship. Structures, the environment in which we belong to and have to operate within, can influence our agency, our ability to act within said environment. However, we are also constrained and shaped by how we think about the world and how people talk about the world. These two concepts really shape a lot of different disparities in the US, and they come from anthropology primarily, but they are starting to be co-opted by other disciplines, including, for instance, critical feminism and public health as well. So you maybe even have heard both of these terms used in everyday sort of contexts in those environments. So I am also a medical anthropologist who has a critical perspective towards understanding health. So I would be remiss to not talk about how health is also biocultural and is influenced by biocultural processes. So, as I hinted at, structural and symbolic violence contribute to health disparities. Here's a basic example. Structural violence, so for instance, the United States predominantly incarcerating Black and other minority men, creates contexts where there's a large amount of individuals in prison for nonviolent drug crimes or petty crimes, for instance. And additionally, these crimes often result in individuals of minority populations getting incarcerated higher than individuals doing the same practice that are, for instance, white Americans. So in a sense, there is structural violence and also structural racism going on in terms of the incarceration of individuals. In our history, you can even think about this in terms of segregation or Jim Crow laws, which supposedly created a separate but equal policy, but really it was separate but unequal in terms of the provision of services and also how this led to a variety of different environmental consequences, including the redlining of certain areas as a white area and this is a Black area. And businesses predominantly were supported by policies which placed them into the so-called white areas, which led to really there being disparities in the built environments concerning access to grocery stores or access to quality education as well. Symbolic violence can cause stress, which I've talked about in great detail already, among other factors as well. Racism in the US is multifaceted, and I'm predominantly focusing on the experience of Black Americans, predominantly Black male Americans or men in the US, because I think they are the most salient examples. However, for instance, going with this example, if Black men are at higher rates of being incarcerated for non-violent drug crimes, they may also be influenced by racism in terms of their experience with dealing with the police, for instance, and high rates of stress with dealing with the police. This, of course, is very relevant to the current situation we have today in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and violence against minority groups by members of the police, which again is a very loaded subject. But we're talking about weighty, loaded subjects here. So shifting gears a little bit to focus on the experience of minority women as well. Stress can lead to maternal complications, which I've already mentioned. So for instance, stress, for instance through racism as an example, that has been internalized by the biological female that is carrying a fetus, can result in the low birth weight of the fetus. Also preterm infants, which can lead to a variety of different health consequences throughout their life, and other biological consequences, including, for instance, higher exposure or risks for developing diabetes and obesity. So the experience of the biological mother, basically, can impact health over the life course of that infant. So look at this chart here I have on the right. It's a cyclical process for a reason, and it is very important you sort of think about these processes. So the maternal health of the biological female that is pregnant is influenced by her social and built environment. Her nutrition and her quality of life concerning, for instance, is she stressed? Does she feel safe in her environment? Can shape the development of the fetus over time. This is called the developmental origins of health and disease, also known as the fetal origins hypothesis. But taking this example and sort of running with it, let's say this mother experienced a lot of racism, which caused a lot of stress, and she also did not have access to quality food and nutrition. That infant gets essentially programmed in a term called epigenetics, basically how the environments can influence your health while even in the fetus. This child now is predisposed to high blood pressure, to diabetes, to obesity, and then as they develop, they may have health consequences because of those risk factors, because their mother experienced high rates of stress and or violence and or poor nutritional quality. Now, as that child develops into an adult, let's say, this child, we'll just say that she's a female, she also gets pregnant. She is predisposed to the same maternal complications that her mother experienced because she has, in her life history, been exposed to risk factors for developing different consequences in terms of her biological health. In a sense, the experience of your grandmother can influence your own health, which is a sort of hard concept to grasp at first. But basically what we're trying to say here in this class is that health is biocultural in the sense that your environment, and really you can think of culture as basically just your social and built environments as well, can shape your own health. And it also can shape the health of future generations over time because of the experiences that you faced, which basically programmed some aspect of your biology to have higher risk factors for a variety of different health consequences. So in a sense, race can be seen physically through health. Not saying there is a biological indicator of this is a Black individual, but this is an indicator more accurately as an individual that has experienced generationally even higher rates of stress or higher rates of poor nutritional quality over time. Borrowing/stealing from public health, because I think it's a good sort of example of how this sort of balloons out. You have the individual, which is the red circle in the middle. This is you as a person, your age, your sex, and other constitutional factors such as your health and wellness, for instance. Your lifestyle factors, basically what you eat, who you talk to, what kind of work you perform, is based on your environment. And your agency is limited by some capacity by your environment and your ability to think about the different options that are available to you. These are then shaped by your social and community networks. For instance, what kind of friends you have, your neighborhood, is it safe to walk outside, is it safe to exercise, do you feel you're stuck inside of your home because you don't want to risk going outside and potentially, for instance, experiencing violence. Then you have your working conditions, which can be very broad, including, sorry, it's my phone, your work environment, your working conditions. Are you unemployed, for instance? Think about that in terms of COVID-19 right now. If you are unemployed, and potentially still having to pay rent, as an example, you are having to experience a lot of economic burdens right now, which can shape the amount of stress that you are experiencing as well. Additionally, water and sanitation, which we take largely for granted in the US, is a huge factor on your health and wellness. And we'll get over the distinction of those two terms in a future presentation. But basically know that your access to services, basically, and your ability to interact with your environments can also shape your own health. Then, in terms of anthropology, the most relevant level for us is the very top bar here, which is your economic status, your cultural, of course, and environmental conditions. For instance, what kind of foods does your culture like to eat? What kind of environments does your culture like to interact in? Are you able to speak your native tongue, or are you having to adapt to a very different context now? All of these different factors shape who you are as a person, and you basically are embedded within this larger context of multiple interlocking and overlapping tiers, basically. So we're talking about a very large topic, such as maternal and child health. So let's break it down and look at the sort of on-the-ground reality of what this looks like. I have a chart here from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, that unfortunately breaks down race and ethnicity as an interchangeable topic. So look at the categories here. We have non-Hispanic Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, Hispanic, again very large designation, non-Hispanic White, and Asian. Of course, Asian could mean Japanese, it can mean Chinese, it can mean Mongolian, it can mean Filipino. And then you have Hispanic. Again, what are you talking about here? Are you talking about Belize? Are you talking about Ecuador? Are you talking about Guatemala? So that being said, so take demographic data in terms of statistics primarily with a grain of salt, especially when you have an eye for looking at the difference between race and ethnicity, or really the not how they are used differences in terms of public health practice and epidemiology. But that being said, what does this show you? Well, non-Hispanic Black individuals experience the highest rate of infant mortality, basically infant deaths, in the United States, by a very wide margin compared to other groups. Comparing non-Hispanic Black to non-Hispanic White, for example, they are almost triple, basically double, experiencing the rate of infant mortality compared to white individuals. In the history of the US, this has been blamed on the biology of African American females or women. But now that you have sort of an ear for pointing out how institutional factors and racism can influence maternal and child health, think about this. Again, nutritional status, your built environment in terms of what schools you have access to, do you feel safe walking outside, do you experience racism, can influence your ability to have a safe pregnancy from beginning to full gestation, as well as in the clinic itself. Because additionally, Black women experience the highest rate of maternal mortality in the US too. compared to white individuals, compared to Asian individuals in the US, or Hispanic individuals, for instance. This is broken down in terms of per 1,000 live births. So do the math, and there are a lot of black women in the US experiencing infant mortality every year, disproportionately so compared to other ethnic groups. So that is it for now. I would love to keep going, of course, but I also said I would not take your entire time here. So what I'm going to do is there are a few more slides. I'm going to bump them to Wednesday's lecture, but also don't worry, Wednesday's lecture is not going to be super long either. At least it won't hit the end of the time slot that I have for you guys. So hopefully you enjoyed this presentation, and also you understand the very complicated topics in which we're trying to really dive into now in this class. And as always, if you have any questions, please just let me know. This is sort of an echo chamber for me. I've heard from a decent amount of you asking a random question or wanting some more clarification, which is fantastic. That's what I want. And again, if you have any concerns that you would like to maybe have, let's say, in a Zoom or Microsoft Teams meeting as well, we can schedule that and find something that works for you and your busy schedule, I'm sure. So, yep, have a nice rest of your day, and I will see you via my recording on Wednesday's lecture.